Kerby Anderson.
Thank you. Joining me, it is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to have two guests, one in studio, one by phone. But, you know, every time I come to this microphone, I try to think of what would be most important to you. You know, we sometimes focus on what is in the news, but oftentimes that tends to be a bit of a distraction from things that are going to have greater impact on you. We talk so often here about Point of View, about your faith, your family, and your freedom. And I've talked about this before. It's one of my frustrations sometimes about local television news is that it focuses on the things that maybe really aren't that important to you, because a car crash is visually interesting, or at least it's visual. Oftentimes that gets a lot of coverage, even though it maybe affected the lives or even the cars of two individuals, maybe backed up traffic for a little bit. And yet a serious discussion about tax rates at your local city council affects you much more, but it's not terribly visually interesting. And so as a result, that is the case. You know, we have, of course, had the Minnesota trial, Minneapolis trial in the news. And even yesterday, let's face it, we had the Millennial Roundtable kind of cover that. And I will have some comments a little bit later, but even there to talk more about some of the need for us once again to have discernment in terms of the way media has covered some of these events. And of course, we will also see the Justice Department doing an investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department and maybe other places around the country. So it may affect you, but probably not as much as something that is actually taking place today. And that is, of course, the President's Earth Summit. This is, of course, Earth Day, something I'm well aware of. When the Earth Day started in 1970, I was in high school, but I had been kind of involved in some of the environmental issues. And I was able to invite one of the people from the Sierra Club to come and speak to our high school. But over time, I began to be a little more concerned about the fact that the environmental movement was adopting a lot of ideas and philosophies that kind of raise questions. But you've got to recognize now that what we have is the president saying he wants to actually reduce our carbon emissions by 50% by the end of this decade, by 2030. To give you a little bit more on that, our first article has the title Earth Day and John Kerry. Because, first of all, it talks about the fact that John Kerry's kind of our czar on the Earth Day. And as a result, he's returned from China, and they've actually said that they're in with us on this Earth Day and on this climate crisis. But let's be honest, I think they'll give a lot of lip service to that, but certainly not much more. In case you're wondering, the United States is not the greatest emitter of carbon dioxide. China is. Twice as much. And I'll give you some of those numbers in just a minute. But I thought it was interesting, this article that, first of all, gives you some of the facts and figures between John Kerry, China, Earth Day, and the rest. By the bottom of the first page, it then talks about, in just a couple of days, Stephen Koonin, who was the chief scientist for the former President Barack Obama's Department of Energy. So obviously one who was involved in the Obama-Biden administration. Nevertheless, is publishing a new book. And I want to read the book, and maybe we'll have him on. If not, I'll just summarize it for you, in which it debunks most of this climate alarmism and actually is very concerned about the fact that by actually focusing on all of this as an emergency, he points out, and of course the title of it is Unsettled, meaning it isn't settled science at all. And this, again, I've got to remind you, was one of the climate scientists under Barack Obama. So I think it's just another individual that we've quoted from time to time who might not necessarily agree with a lot of the things that we say around this table, but nevertheless is pointing out some of the same things we've been pointing out as well. But again, the goal here is to actually have 50 of course, the White House even said maybe 52% of the reduction in carbon emissions by the end of this decade, so that we will have zero emissions, net zero emissions from the economy by 2050. And so these are really, I think, unbelievable numbers, and I'll explain why that is in just a minute. Senator Edward Markey, who is, of course, the senator from Massachusetts, said that he thinks Biden's 50% emissions reduction reduction target is technologically feasible and well within our reach. I'll get back to that in just a minute, probably after the break, but to point out that there are all sorts of other people that are even calling for more. Now, it doesn't surprise you, does it? Here's one from Greta Thunberg. You might remember her. At the age of 15, she started skipping school so that she could actually protest outside the Swedish parliament. She's all of 18 now. I would assume she does not even have a high school degree. Not even sure, since she was skipping school, whether she's ever had a class in biology or chemistry or physics, because that would be helpful when we're talking about this. But nevertheless, she's calling upon Congress. Yes, this is an 18-year-old calling upon Congress, holding them accountable for these climate catastrophes unfolding around the world. You have to figure out which ones those are. And then at the end says, but I don't believe for a second that you'll actually do this. Okay, well, thank you so very much. One of the other climate activists decided to dump BS in front of the White House. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. If you have not seen this, I'm not making this up. This shows you what happens on Earth Day. These wheelbarrows, they look like they're about 8 wheelbarrows full of, can we call them cow poo? Can we call them that? You know what I'm talking about here. Okay. And they literally wheel them down Pennsylvania Avenue and dump the poo or the manure or whatever word I can be allowed to say on a family broadcast in front of the White House. And that's because they're protesting the BS, they use different words as you might imagine, climate plan. So it doesn't go far enough to try to reduce all of our carbon emissions by the next decade, half of them by the next decade, and all of them by 2050. For those of you that, if nothing else, like PragerU, and we do, I love this piece. I'll just hold it up for those of you watching, but I'll describe it for those of you that cannot watch online, because on the left-hand side, it has PragerU's climate experts. Michael Schellenberger, well, he was on with Dr. Merrill Matthews, Patrick Moore, I've had him on with us, Alex Epstein. By the way, a good number of these individuals. Patrick Moore has a PhD. Will Happer has a PhD in physics from Princeton. They're the sort of the climate experts for PragerU. And then on the right-hand side, they have the climate experts being used right now. I just mentioned one, Greta Thunberg. Okay, doesn't have a high school degree. Leonardo DiCaprio, don't know if he had, I'm pretty sure he didn't have a college degree for sure. Actor. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she does have an economics degree, although you wouldn't know it some days. Al Gore, anyway, it's kind of having a little bit of fun at the fact that you're having some of these outspoken individuals that in terms of credibility, scientifically don't have a great deal. And if that's not enough, they also have posted, and you may have seen this today, some of the predictions. Back in 1970, for example, Paul Ehrlich, who was at Stanford, and I was growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I knew of him, heard him speak. Between 1980 and 1989, some 4 billion people, including 65 million Americans, will perish in the great die-off. Of course, it's got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The world's going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. So some of those predictions haven't quite borne out yet, but I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about this by what it really would require to get rid of carbon by the end of this decade. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Progressives in Washington, D.C. are supporting several measures that target the core values upon which this nation was built. Here are some examples. There are many dangerous elements of the Equality Act, but one of the most alarming is the way it targets religious freedom. There isn't a more fundamental American value than religious freedom. And the For the People Act is another dangerous bill before the Congress. Not only would this bill weaken our election security by subjecting elections to federal control, it would also violate the constitutional principle of allowing states to determine their own election rules and procedures. This takes more power away from the people. These are just a couple of examples of the way progressive legislation and political policies are undermining core American values. Obviously, they cause all of us great concern, as they should. And yet there is very good reason to be optimistic about America's future. Some recent surveys illustrate this very well. Did you know that 73% of Americans believe that the nation should be unified around the values of freedom, equality, and self-governance? That's according to a Rasmussen survey from last year. A 2019 Gallup poll found that a majority of Americans identify as either conservative or moderate. The leftist fringes of society may be aggressive in their political agenda, but they don't represent the average American. Americans can make the right decisions for our future only if they are given the right information, and by that I mean the truth. That's what we're committed to giving our listeners at Point of View, the truth. And when you give to Point of View, you give more Americans access to that truth so that they can make godly decisions for their lives and for the future of our nation. You can go to www.pointofview.net to give.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that kind of our theme this week is Hope for America. My commentary today is on that subject. I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. And we have a banner there where you can actually donate to this ministry, because even in the midst of some of the things we'll be talking about today, there is hope. As a matter of fact, in the next hour, we're going to have Lathan Watts with us. And again, I try to give you a sense of hope because you would not know if you listen to the mainstream media the number of religious liberty cases that just First Liberty alone are winning, not to mention some by Alliance Defending Freedom and the American Center for Law and Justice and others. So we are going to talk about a lot of very encouraging things that are happening in the midst of the kind of discouraging news you hear every single day on the news. But for just a minute, I want to stay on this topic for a little bit longer because this is Earth Day. And one of the things that people always think about is, what can I do to reduce my carbon emissions? And the answer you're going to find very quickly is you can't really do a whole lot, simply because we can't change your life. And also because if you want to get something to write with right now, and number 1 to 5, I'm going to pull some great material from Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Now, I quoted him in a commentary the other day and got criticism. Why are you quoting Bill Gates? Because Bill Gates is sort of making our point, even when he's not trying to. And you've heard me sometimes quote from Alan Dershowitz, who may not agree with a lot of things we talk about here. Jonathan Turley certainly does not agree with some of the things we say here. And Bill Gates, well, would we disagree with some of the things Bill Gates is proposing? Of course we would. But what is so interesting is I've taken the time to read through his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, but the subtitle tells you everything. The solutions we have, which are few, and the breakthroughs we need, which are major. And this helps you understand that if you want to try to hit this target of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide, first of all, you can stop breathing because you're producing carbon dioxide right now as you breathe out, which actually is something that the plants around you need. So let's not see this as toxic. But one of the things that should be eye-opening to anybody that would read Bill Gates' book is to find out that today there'll be a lot of people saying, well, maybe you should ride a bicycle to work, maybe you should walk to work, maybe you should turn the thermostat down a degree for your house. It's going to make so little difference. Let's work from 1 to 5. Number 1, write down making things. That's 31%. That's the largest category. The largest thing that produces carbon dioxide in the environment is making things, primarily things like cement, aluminum, but also steel and plastics. So all of that has to do with the industries necessary. Now, if you want to just say, look, we'll just not build any more buildings, we'll not produce any more aluminum, not any more steel, not any more plastic, not any more concrete for the roads, knock yourself out. And this is where Bill Gates is kind of face to face with his own reality. We got to figure out some ways to produce these kinds of things without producing carbon dioxide, because his goal is, again, to try to completely be carbon zero in 2050. And so he's looking at technological solutions for that, because to his credit, he recognizes that if we just simply tell everybody stop using fossil fuels, then what about all the people in developing countries? He talks about, and you've seen this before, and you looked at a map of the world at night, or have you ever flown over parts of the world at night, whether it's Africa, lots of Asia and other places, very few lights, because after all, they're still living in third world countries. And if we want to bring them up to even close to our standard of living, well, we just can't tell them not to use fossil fuels, but we have to figure out something better than fossil fuels or carbon capture or something. So number one, making things, 31%. Number two, plugging in electric generation. Now, again, some of our electricity is produced by nuclear, but most of the environmental activists don't like nuclear. Then some of it, hydroelectric, a little bit by solar and wind. But again, he makes a very strong case. Anytime somebody says, well, we can meet all of our needs just with solar, ask them how many solar panels in the parts of the country you would need to do so. And of course, he runs the numbers and shows that's simply impossible. We don't have the land, nor would people put up with that. Wind, all the rest of it. So again, that's another big issue. How do we generate energy? And now he's quite willing to consider some of these nuclear options, which his other, if you will, fellow environmentalists were not. So making things, plugging in, if you're adding it up, you're already up to 58% before we get to the third category, which is growing things, plants and animals. And of course, we hear about the animals producing methane. Yes, they do. And of course, he also recognizes that this argument that we'd have to just get rid of all the meat eating is not going to happen. It's too much tied to culture and those kinds of things. So we're going to have to try to figure out some other solutions there. But that's 19%. And if you start doing the math here, you're recognizing that now more than 3/4 of all of those things are really sort of outside your control. Maybe you have a farm, maybe you have a company that manufactures plastics, probably not. And so then you get to the ones that most people tend to focus on. Number 4, he calls it getting around. Planes, cars, trucks, ships. And believe me, you just can't put a solar panel on the top of a passenger airplane and expect it to get from coast to coast. Not happening. And there's even an interesting conversation he had with somebody saying, well, why can't we just charge up batteries? He says the number of batteries you need to be heavier than the plane itself. And so you just start running into this. And finally, the last one, number 5, keeping warm and cool, 7%. Heating, cooling, refrigeration. And the point I'm making is that right now you're going to hear all sorts of people saying, ride a bike, turn down the thermostat. But if you start looking at where carbon dioxide is produced, you can honestly realize almost instantaneously it's just not going to happen. And so that is just a short little conversation on the whole issue, of course, of Earth Day. We'll probably come back to it. I may even devote an entire hour sometime in the future to it. But okay, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about the trial in Minneapolis. And I thought I'd quote from a couple of people that just remind us of all the things that maybe weren't necessarily covered very well by the press. For example, Jonah Goldberg says, I think President Joe Biden's and Representative Maxine Waters' comments before the verdict were indefensible. You might recognize what she said. We talked about that the other day. Joe Biden basically wanted a guilty verdict. And he said, when I criticized Biden on Twitter, the inevitable response came back, well, Trump did the same thing. And so, first of all, Jonah Goldberg said, well, yes, he did, but not really exactly the same thing. And I criticized him for it. And so just because Trump did it doesn't mean Biden should to it, and frankly, there is a difference. And when you start looking at all of the issues, you certainly see that as well. The other thing that some people have pointed out is that you actually had Derek Chauvin, before even the trial, had to flee his home. I don't know how many people covered that. His home was vandalized. I don't know how many people covered that. You might remember Kim Potter, the officer that accidentally discharged her weapon thinking it was a taser. Well, they have had to erect barricades around her house. And of course, if you are not familiar, and I don't know how well the press covered this, one of the defense witnesses had pig's blood spread all over the home and was vandalized. And again, probably didn't hear too much about that. And then, as Dinesh D'Souza pointed out in his tweet the other day, he asked, is there any independent evidence at all that Derek Chauvin is a racist or white supremacist? Did this issue even come up during the trial? I'm asking because that's all I hear Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Democrats talking about. And, of course, they didn't bring it up in the trial because they focused on what I think would be legitimately called police brutality. And the race issue was added by BLM. And so it just helps us understand there's a narrative being proposed right now. And if nothing else, I think it is really important for you to exercise a level of discernment in that regard. And so as we go to a break, let me just mention that we have our Hope for America theme this week. And it really is a reminder that even in the midst of some of the news we're talking about, as I point out in the piece, there was a Rasmussen survey that was done that found that 73% of Americans think that values like freedom and equality and self-governance are what we need in this country. We have all sorts of other surveys that remind us of the fact that, indeed, we have all sorts of people being fed wrong information. And so that's one of the reasons why this week we're really trying to have an emphasis on hope for America. My commentary is about that. Our material is there. And if you find yourself saying, I am hearing so many things on Point of View I hear nowhere else, can I encourage you maybe just click on the button there that says donate and maybe just give a gift to say, we appreciate the fact that you're trying to speak truth in a culture that seems to have lost its way and a media that just doesn't seem to be able to tell the truth. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about corporations right after these important messages.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is our Thursday edition. Let me just mention a minute ago, I was talking about climate change. Here's our booklet on climate change that you might want to get. Gets into some of the facts and figures, some of the predictions that I mentioned just a minute ago about certainly Paul Ehrlich and the rest. And so that is available to you if you don't have a copy of that. And we'll get back into it maybe in the next hour as we're talking about Help for America. And Lathan Watts will be with us for the entire next hour. But at the moment, we are going to come back to an issue we've been talking about, especially with our listeners in the state of Georgia. And that is, you remember when, for example, Coca-Cola really jumped into this whole debate about elections. And we'll get into that in more detail. Matter of fact, one of my other articles there is Burgess Owens responding to that as well. But, you know, after Coca-Cola jumped in, it was interesting because a Rasmussen poll found that adults were 37% less likely to buy that product. Men 40%, women 34%, Republicans 52% less likely to go buy Coca-Cola. Got a piece here by Senator Rick Scott. Dear woke corporations, beware of the backlash that's coming. And the article I've posted here comes from the American Conservative Union announcing a pushback on the leftward lurch of U.S. corporations by establishing the Center to Protect Voters and Their Voices. And to explain some of this, we come to the conversation with Dan Schneider, who is the executive director of the American Conservative Union, the oldest and largest grassroots conservative organization, individual that served as chief of staff under Congressman Jim Ryan, later served in the U.S. Department of Labor under the George Bush administration, has also more recently even advised Senator Mitch McConnell on the selection of conservative candidates for federal board positions. And so, Dan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I want to, first of all, promote to some of our listeners that may not even know about American Conservative Union. Now, you got to recognize, even back in the days when Marlon Maddox was a host, we oftentimes talked about it, but I recognize we have a whole generation of young people that may not know about ACU. And more importantly, I wanted to use this to talk about this new center that you're putting together, because I'll have to tell you, quite a number of our listeners have called in and are very frustrated that Delta, Coca-Cola, Major League Baseball, or here in the Texas where we broadcast today, American Airlines, Dell Computers, all of them are bringing the force of their corporations against lawmakers that are trying to make sure that we have free and fair elections. What can you tell us about this new center?
Well, Kerby, some of your listeners might know my organization better than they realize if they've heard of CPAC, the big conservative conference. That's our conference. We host every year, and then we hold other CPACs around the country and also around the world. But ACU was founded by the best and brightest conservatives back in the 60s, and we have been fighting ever since. And we've been holding CPAC for 50 years, too. And in addition to the conferences we hold, we're very active on policy and protecting the constitutional rights of Americans. And right now, we see that our right to vote and our right to speak are under assault like they've never been before. So we've launched the Center to Protect Voters and Their Voices. We initially to focus on rebuilding all of the safeguards in our elections that were torn down by the Democrats in the 2020 election. But as the year progressed and all of these corporations started to fight against us, calling people like your listeners, calling people like the members of ACU racists, simply because we want to make sure that every legal voter gets to vote, but only vote once. And that if you're not a legal voter, you don't get to vote. It's that simple. But these woke corporations, they are trying to muzzle the voices who are trying to simply get reasonable legislation so we can have free and fair elections.
Dan Schneider with us. Let me just mention that he'll be with us for about half an hour, and I suspect some of you want to make some comments or ask some questions. So let me open the phones right now. We've got a number of other things I want to cover, but I just wanted to give you that opportunity because in the next hour we're going to move on to another topic. So again, you can give us a call, 800-351-1212, if you have some concerns about these corporations jumping in. And of course, we have a link to the website that you can find. You can simply go to pointofview.net or go to conservative.org. But especially what we have there is that you say on behalf of more than 100 million Americans, the American Conservative Union is taking a stand against the divisive and partisan activism of these corporations and organizations, which are in a sense saying that just asking for a photo ID is voter suppression. And yet, Dan, last time I flew on Delta Airlines, and it's been a while, I must admit, they ask for my photo ID, and yet they don't seem to think that asking for a photo ID to vote is even within the realm of possibility and a good example of racism. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's so interesting. You started this talking about how Georgia is especially impacted because of, there was the Senate race in Georgia, and then we had a big corporation in Georgia that came out in opposition to these laws. And, of course, Major League Baseball then announced that it's moving the All-Star game from Georgia to Denver, Colorado. And there's just two really important points about that Major League Baseball game. I think many of your listeners may have already heard that we were going to, as a nation, we were going to celebrate Henry Aaron, who played for the Atlanta Braves.
Yes.
The first black, the best slugger, black baseball player of all time, probably. It's certainly one of the most popular and great human being, great athlete. And that was going to be the time for the entire nation to honor him and respect him in his hometown where he played Major League Baseball for his career. And instead, we're going to move from a city that's 51% a majority African-American. We're going to move to a state that is a fine state, but it's almost all white. Yet these woke people wanted to move out of Georgia, out of Atlanta, to a state where their voter laws are even more protective of the right to vote than Georgia, the newly passed Georgia law. It makes no sense. This is how crazed these radical left-wingers are. They want to make a political statement. They want to muzzle us. They want to shout us down. They want to claim that if you are simply trying to raise reasonable questions and come up with reasonable solutions, that you are out of bounds, that you are a racist.
One of the things I think so interesting, and this maybe fits more with Amazon, but I think it still could have fit some of these corporations as well, in which they really have a problem with making sure that the right people vote when it comes to union elections. And I'm thinking of one of those votes recently for Amazon. But then they criticize any attempt to making sure that the right people vote when it comes to a popular election. And I do sense a little bit of hypocrisy there, don't you?
Well, it's a massive hypocrisy. There are lots of rules around how employees in an organization can vote, whether to unionize or not. And Amazon went to court to try to stifle that vote, to try to prevent lots of the employees from voting. So on one hand, when they think that it's to their personal financial advantage to suppress votes, they're all for it. On the other hand, when reasonable Americans, the majority of Americans, it used to be a wide bipartisan group of Americans, wanted to make sure that voter IDs existed, that there was signature verification, that Amazon now claims that those things, widely supported in America, the three out of four Americans support those sorts of provisions. Amazon claims that we're racist because of it. Yes, Kirby, you're exactly right. Huge hypocrisy.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's take some phone calls if you'd like to join us. 1-800-351-1212. Dan Schneider will be with us in just after the break as well. And I just thought I might mention, I haven't posted this, but some of you are very familiar with Senator Rick Scott, and he put out this kind of open letter to those that are corporate leaders. And he said, let me give you woke corporate leaders a heads up. Everyone can see the game you are playing. Everyone can see your lies. You're the naked emperor. That is pretty incredible. You are, in fact, morally inferior to the working men and women of this great country who are not racist and who, unlike you, care about the truth. But when we come back from the break, I want to get Dan's comments about this as well, because a little bit later on, he talks about the fact that a good and great people are going to rise up and stand up for the truth. They're going to stand up for their principles. They're going to stand up for their country. So cancel as many people as you can right now. Make as much money off, I love this, slave labor in communist China as you can now. Keep telling your customers how racist and sexist, unsophisticated they are, because the backlash is coming. So just another comment or two. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll take some of those phone calls and also talk a little bit more about this center to protect voters and their voices. We wanted you to know about that. If you want to support the American Conservative Union or sign up, we have all that information on our website, because I think the backlash is coming, and I'd like to know where you stand on it. So we'll take a break, get your calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Georgia. Sammy, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Dan Schneider. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm from Georgia, and I'm proud of the governor for doing what he's doing and standing up. I believe there was a lot of underhanded things done in the election. I believe we need voter ID. I believe if we're not a citizen, we don't need to be voting. I believe it's an American right, and also, as far as I'm concerned, we need to quit backing down to these businesses and sports affiliations for money. And all I've got to say is I stand behind the governor, and I say let's support him. As a conservative, I support him. And if they want to go, let them go, because we'll pray about it, and the Lord will answer our prayers, and he'll take care of us.
Well, I appreciate that phone call. And Dan, again, the organization that you have been a part of course, decades, American Conservative Union, now has a new center to protect voters and their voices. And some people might say, okay, I'm not going to buy a Coca-Cola, or I might not buy Gillette razors or go to Target or whatever they might decide to do. First of all, I think they should let the organization know why they aren't buying that product or that service. But second of all, I think you've got some ideas on how to promote voter integrity, and that's something you're going to be working on over the next couple of months. True?
Yeah. Sammy raised many good points, and the Georgia legislature really improved lots of the things from the 2020 election. And Sammy speaks for a huge chunk of Americans. Very common sense things like, you need a voter ID to be able to vote. Guess what? If you want to buy a ticket to watch a Major League Baseball game and you do it online, you've got to be able to prove, you've got to show an ID just to get that credit card. And you've got to be able to prove that you are who you say you are. Obviously, you mentioned, Kerby, that for Delta, you got to have an ID to get on a plane. Every single one of these businesses, they require IDs at one time or another before you can engage with them, before you can buy their product, before you can go to their meetings. Even the Democratic National Conference, when the Democrats select their own president, after the primaries, you could not get into the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, without showing government ID. These same people who required ID to go to their party, to go to their convention, they say it's racist for Americans to have to show that they're actually U.S. citizens, to actually show that they are who they say they are. It's just outrageous.
And again, I've looked at some of the numbers for Georgia. I've mentioned there's more than 1,000, maybe 2,000 individuals that they can identify in Georgia that do not have a voter ID. And it seems to me, or government ID, that first of all, they can go online and get one. Second of all, let's just make sure everybody has one, because how else could you function? You can't go into certain government buildings. Right now, at least where I am, you can't even get a COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer, Moderna, whatever, if they reestablish Johnson & Johnson without showing an ID. You can't buy cold medicine without an ID. You sometimes can't even get welfare benefits. Let's just help the few people that don't have a government-issued ID a chance to come into the 21st century the way the rest of us take for granted every single day. And that seems like the better answer, don't you think?
Yeah, Kerby, and you're really hitting on one of the key parts to this. It really isn't about voter IDs. This is raw, unadulterated, knockdown, smash-mouth politics. This is just an opportunity for Democrats to claim that Republicans are racist. We had more African Americans vote for Donald Trump in the last presidential election than they voted for any other Republican in presidential history in modern times, in recent years. And the Democrats are terrified that African Americans and union workers of all colors and working Americans of all genders, race, creeds, that they are seeing a new Republican Party with a new emphasis on everyday Americans, and that scares the Democrats. So they have, one of the reasons they're doing this is because of raw politics. And, Kerby, let me go back to another point. There are two different kinds of corporations here that are attacking this common sense legislation. One kind of corporation is the kind that is desperate to win the favors of the Biden administration. if you look at Delta Airlines, half of the political donations from the Delta Airlines employees, literally half for the presidential race, went to Biden, and the other half, almost to the penny, went to Donald Trump. The employees at Delta Airlines were evenly split, but when it comes to the Senate races and the House races, those Delta employees skewed heavily towards the Republicans. So now Delta Airlines has a problem. A majority of the political donations that it raised among its own employees went to Republicans. And on the presidential race, half opposed Biden. Yet Delta Airlines is heavily regulated by the U.S. government. The Federal Aviation Administration, of course, is involved in airline administration. Delta Airlines has always opposed, there's a thing called an Export-Import Bank.
Oh, sure.
Government entity. And Delta has opposed XM subsidizing foreign aircraft carriers. So now it's trying to curry favor with the Biden administration. That's one reason that Delta is doing this, because they've got lots of government benefits. You can call it even like welfare benefits, and they're trying to protect those welfare benefits.
For sure.
But there's another motivation for Delta. They've got a fairly new CEO and a new general counsel, and both of those gentlemen are radicalized left-wingers.
Yeah.
That corporation is now being run by hardcore left people. That used not to be the case, but it is today.
And again, as I say before, people that are moderate and conservative also buy tickets to go to baseball games, also buy tickets to fly on airplanes, and also buy Coca-Cola, although it looks like that's changing rather dramatically. And let me just mention, the last article I've posted here is from Representative Burgess Owens, who takes on this whole idea of Jim Crow 2021 and said, look, I grew up around Jim Crow laws, so I know what I'm talking about. And, of course, he just kind of rips them. So we'll get into that in the next hour when we have in studio with us Lathan Watts. But just before we wind down, you've given us some kind of the background story on some of these corporations. But if people find themselves saying, well, that's a really good information, I'd like to know more about the American Conservative Union, just go to conservative.org, correct?
That's right. That's our website. And we need help. We are people who follow us, people who ask to help in our work. We are able to send them phone numbers of members of Congress, or make it very simple for them to send an email communication to their members of Congress or to their state legislatures, or in this case, to the CEO of Delta Airlines, to the commissioner of Major League Baseball, the NCAA. We're also, in a fist fight with the National Collegiate Athletic Association. You may like, the basketball tournament, but the NCAA has turned radical. So all of these big corporations that are either out of fear of left-wing boycotts or because they themselves are now being run by the radical left, we have got to tell these corporations, stick to your business. Stick to producing a beverage. Stick to producing a quality air flight. Stick to producing a good pharmaceutical drug, Eli Lilly. Don't get involved in cultural issues.
Right. Don't take sides in the culture war. Yeah.
That's right. That's for the Americans to fight out, not for the corporations.
Dan, appreciate you being with us. We're going to take a break. And again, thank you for joining us. We have that second article that has a link to American Conservative Union and this new Center to Protect Voters and Their Voices. And then we have next hour, Lathan Watts in studio. I know he's got a couple of opinions about some of the things we've talked about, and we're going to give you an update on some very important religious liberty cases. All that coming up right after this.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. In our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we have in studio with us Lathan Watts, who is the Director of Public Affairs for First Liberty Institute. And just in a few minutes, we will get into some of these successes that are taking place that you wouldn't know about unless you listen to Point of View. Let me also mention this is part of our theme for this week, Hope for America. You probably by now, if you receive mail from me, have received something in your mailbox that talks about this theme of Hope for America. My commentary today is about Hope for America, and the banner there is Hope for America, because we point out that, as I mentioned earlier, 73% of Americans believe that the nation should be unified around freedom, equality, and self-governance. A Gallup poll shows that a majority of Americans are either moderate or conservative. You wouldn't know that by watching the mainstream press, but and sometimes they're very loud, but I think we need to speak up as well. And Lathan, we were going to get right to the religious liberty issues, but you had a chance to hear the interview I did with Dan Schneider, and it got you going. And you suggested that maybe the governor of Georgia, we were just talking about the governor of Georgia just a minute ago, Sammy called in. And by the way, if you want to call in, 1-800-351-1212, we'll keep on this topic for another couple of minutes. You had a very creative suggestion on what the governor should do, and not that the governor's listening right now, but maybe somebody could get it to him. You had a very creative idea what the governor should do.
Yeah, CNN has made a lot of hay out of this voter integrity bill in Georgia, and they've run I don't know how many stories, and frankly, most of them have been misinformation more than they have been news. And if I was advising, Governor Kemp, I would say, you know what, Governor, let's go downtown, let's have a press conference on the sidewalk right in front of CNN headquarters in downtown Atlanta, and say, you know what, CNN, why don't you put your money where your mouth is? If you think this bill is so bad, and you want to run all of these, false reports about it, then why are you still here? If it's that bad, you're going to encourage everybody else to boycott this state. Why? I mean, you left. Don't let the screen door hit you in the rear end on the way out of the state.
Wow.
And go on. And by the way, let me, drop me a line. Let me know, hey, like the commercial real estate rates up in New York.
Yes.
Where you'd feel more at home, or
yes.
L.A.
And I've wondered if the governor should just get in front of the Atlanta stadium there and the ballpark there and just simply remind people of how many individuals, maybe even African Americans, who would have been working at that ballpark that day that will not get paid. How many of those hotels you're looking around are actually going to be half empty because individuals that would have come in for the All-Star game are not there. How many of these restaurants didn't benefit from all of that because in a moment of impetuousness, they decided to pull what would have been a great honor for Hank Aaron in Atlanta and move it to Denver. And those are the kinds of things that I'm starting to see some of the governors. The governor of the state of Florida right now, Governor DeSantis, he doesn't back off on some of these issues. And maybe Governor Kemp ought to take a page from that and challenge CNN, challenge Major League Baseball, and say, since you are so gifted at lying and taking material from the president that received 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to go somewhere. That
bastion of conservative thought, the Washington Post.
Isn't that just amazing? Yeah. Let me, again, open you up the phones in case you'd like to join us. But let me just, before we get to, and we will after the break, get to all these religious liberty cases. One of the articles I've posted is what took place the other day. And again, the mainstream press probably didn't cover this, so you'll hear this maybe only on Point of View. But the Senate Democrats decided to hold a hearing to condemn the various voting laws in Georgia and other places, which they called Jim Crow 2021. So instead of calling it Jim Crow 2.0 or Jim Eagle 2.0, whatever that meant, I never understood that, the Senate Democrats held a meeting. Well, Representative Burgess Owens, African-American, played for the Oakland team of Raiders and other things, representative now out of Utah, he decided to come to the meeting and testify. He says, as someone who's actually experienced Jim Crow laws, I would like to set the record straight on the myths regarding the recently passed Georgia state law and why any comparison between this law and Jim Crow is absolutely outrageous. He went on to tell his family's story, talked about his great-great-grandfather, Saul Burgess, who was shackled in the belly of a slave ship. It talks about escaping freedom via the Underground Railroad. And by the way, this article is posted because you really want to read the whole story, but I'm going to skip it because I want to take another phone call as well. But then he finally says, look, I grew up in the era of actual legalized institutional racism. I grew up in the Deep South in Florida in the 1960s during the time of the KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation. And he says, if nothing else, I became the third black athlete to ever receive a scholarship to play at the University of Miami. So then he says, you know that part of the Georgia law that everybody complains about? That says that a person applying for an absentee ballot needs to have a government-issued ID. He says, well, if a voter does not have a driver's license or an ID card, that voter can use a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck of any government document that shows name, address of this voter. And if the voter somehow cannot produce one of these, the voter can still vote and cast a vote through a provisional ballot. He says, oh, by the way, 97% or more of Georgia voters already have an ID. And he says, what I find absolutely offensive is the narrative from the left that black people are not smart enough, not educated enough, not desirous enough of education to do what other culture and races do in this country, to get an ID. And he says the true racism, he's telling it as he's looking at the Democrats in the Senate, the true racism is the projection of the Democratic Party on my proud race. It's called the soft bigotry of low expectations. So 3 cheers for Representative Burgess Owens, who went over from the House of Representatives to the Senate to try to set the record straight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that hearing was a boxing match, the referee would have called a halt to it in the first round. And you know, one thing that I don't think he mentioned in that article or in his testimony, but you know, he's a congressman from Utah.
I know.
Right? I mean, that's
pretty white.
That's one of the whitest states in the union,
yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't looked at the demographics of his district, but it's a pretty safe bet it's not a black majority district.
Yes.
And you know, people of all races voted for that guy. I mean, he is a living, walking, talking, breathing embodiment that refutes all of this notion of, you know, so-called institutional racism. How could he get elected if all white people are inherently racist?
Which brings us back to something we're going to be doing a fair amount of gerrymandering and redistricting, but then it has to go through the Voter Rights Act, and the implication is always that we have to have at least one safe district that is African American, and yet you are found in situations where oftentimes African Americans, Hispanic Americans have won where they are in districts that were considered white districts. So it just, again, this whole idea of counting by race, I think has been pretty much set aside by, for example, the election of Barack Obama, the election of Burgess Owens, and a variety of other people like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on really a racist assumption that a black man can't listen to the needs and concerns of constituents in a white district and somehow represent them, or vice versa. That a white man or a white woman couldn't run in a majority, black district and sit down and listen to those people and understand what their needs are and then go represent them effectively in Congress. The whole notion is nonsense.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let me take a phone call or two, and then we'll move on to some of that because, again, we're trying to talk about some of the things to be hopeful of and the number of positive things happening right now in religious liberty should give you some hope. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Progressives in Washington, D.C. are supporting several measures that target the core values upon which this nation was built. Here are some examples. There are many dangerous elements of the Equality Act, but one of the most alarming is the way it targets religious freedom. There isn't a more fundamental American value than religious freedom. And the For the People Act is another dangerous bill before the Congress. Not only would this bill weaken our election security by subjecting elections to federal control, it would also violate the constitutional principle of allowing states to determine their own election rules and procedures. This takes more power away from the people. These are just a couple of examples of the way progressive legislation and political policies are undermining core American values. Obviously, they cause all of us great concern, as they should, and yet there is very good reason to be optimistic about America's future. Some recent surveys illustrate this very well. Did you know that 73% of Americans believe that the nation should be unified around the values of freedom, equality, and self-governance? That's according to a Rasmussen survey from last year. A 2019 Gallup poll found that a majority of Americans identify as either conservative or moderate. The leftist fringes of society may be aggressive in their political agenda, but they don't represent the average American. Americans can make the right decisions for our future only if they are given the right information, and by that I mean the truth. That's what we're committed to giving our listeners at Point of View, the truth. And when you give to Point of View, you give more Americans access to that truth so that they can make godly decisions for their lives and for the future of our nation. You can go to www.pointofview.net to give.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nathan Watts in studio with us today. Let me just mention some of the resources that we do have. One on voter fraud, which actually was written even before the 2020 election, just to remind you of all the facts, figures, and where you can find the database of that taking place. And of course, we talked about it being Earth Day, so this one on climate change is also available as well. But I do want to go to some of the phone calls, so let's at least take one before we get into some of these issues of religious liberty. So we'll head to Georgia again. And Gabriella, thank you for calling today on Point of View.
Thank you for allowing me to be on the show. I just wanted to call, just make a few statements, and then I'll just get off the air. I just wanted to say that since, the left has been so radicalized, I feel that it is incumbent upon the conservative section of this country, especially the 74 million plus that did vote conservative, to use their power to sway these anti-patriotic corporations who are saying their opinions on what our laws are and so forth, to fight back with boycotts and petitions. And I hope that the conservative organization that is being represented today, that they would have a place on their site where we could sign up on petitions on a regular basis for anybody who is of this radical agenda, that we could show them with our money that we are not going to back up their company if this is the way they choose to go and be anti-patriotic.
We're thinking of doing that. Go ahead, because we will do that. And so that's one of the things we're going to provide even on the Point of View website. But we have another point, so let me let you continue.
Okay, and the fact that we have so many people, I mean, the Hispanic group has gotten so large in this country because of the illegal immigration that's gone on and all of the times that we've let that slide. Nobody considers the fact that not only does that could sway our elections, but also that how with a pandemic, you're just allowing all these people to be caged up and continue to increase the pandemic in this country by numbers, and nobody gets on about that, about how they're all in close quarters, none of them are masked, and so forth and so on. It's not being patriotic to our country by putting our people in jeopardy with a pandemic going on, and nevertheless influencing our elections as well, and getting free medical services from us to take care of their health and not be a contributing member of our society. It's just anti-patriotic, all of that.
Good points. You know, one of the things I was sort of alluding to at the very beginning of the program is the distraction that all this talk about racism and the jury decision in Minneapolis takes away from the fact we still have a crisis at the border that nobody's even talking about, even in the mainstream press. We have some really significant challenges both from China right now and even Iran, and it's just amazing. And then when you have John Kerry coming back from China saying, oh, they're going to go along with us in terms of all of these climate restrictions. No, they're not. And it is just amazing to me. So, Lathan, we can roll our eyes at that. But let's give some people some good news, because you've just won one case after another, and it's just encouraging. So I'll take you to the first case here, and that one is a Christmas display, which I thought we solved all this with the Pawtucket, Rhode Island Christmas Crush Supreme Court decision. Or what about the Bladensburg, I should say, cross case? I thought we solved all these, but you had to deal with it again, didn't you?
Yeah, it's amazing. Sometimes some little towns just don't get the memo, I guess. But I mean, that's fine. You know, sometimes some people have to learn the hard way.
And this is in Delaware, which was represented by, I believe, Joe Biden. Wasn't he the senator?
I think you're right.
Yes,
yeah, the actual town is Rehoboth Beach, where I'm pretty sure he has at least a vacation home. It's probably where he spent most of his campaign, in the basement of that house in Rehoboth Beach. So he may have even heard about this on the local news. But
yes,
we were able to finally get this case resolved. Our client there, the Knights of Columbus, have traditionally put up a creche at Christmas time along it's basically like a boardwalk, a public area, and they've done it for many, many years.
Yes.
And what had not been a problem up until a couple of years ago, and the city started saying they weren't going to do it, and then back and forth, and we had to end up going to court, but we've been able to resolve it without out of court, basically. But the city has, I guess now finally gotten the memo that this is not in any way a violation of the Establishment Clause. And, it was sort of reiterated, like you said, by the Bladensburg decision, our case defending the Bladensburg Peace Cross from a couple of years ago at the Supreme Court, where they basically said, from now on, if a symbol or a monument or a practice is in keeping with the history and tradition of this country, it is presumed constitutional. So probably since there's been a constitution, there has been a creche displayed somewhere at Christmas time. I mean, it's tough to argue that that's not a part of the history and tradition of this country.
Right.
And of course, it in no way compels anyone to worship in a certain way. It doesn't. You're not taxing the people to support a specified church, which is really all the Establishment Clause is about. And so it's clearly not a violation of the First Amendment. But sometimes even when you win a Supreme Court case like that, it takes a while for it to kind of trickle down through the lower courts out into the public consciousness, where people in government and policymakers are aware of it, that the Supreme Court's spoken on this and this is okay. And so whether or not the city just hadn't gotten the memo or they were trying to get around it somehow, that's now been resolved. And our clients, Knights of Columbus, I suspect, will be here in a few months putting up their traditional crash for Christmas time.
You know, and one of the examples of this is how sometimes one complaint creates the situation. I mean, how many times has Coach Kennedy gone to the midfield and prayed until it came to somebody's attention? The other day we were talking with Jeremy Dice about this teenage boy up in Colorado that wanted to honor the military, and all it took is one complaint from our humanist friends, in quotes, who then complain, and then all of a sudden, you say, really? I mean, you're offended by something you can walk by and you can avert your eyes if that really bothers you, but nevertheless, just one person complaining sometimes creates these situations, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It can be, one person complaining or a group like the Humanist Association or Mikey Weinstein out in his basement in New Mexico, who claims to have someone who's offended by it, but but they want to remain anonymous, right? So you just trust him that he has somebody that's complained, and that can be all, and that can sometimes be all it takes for some elected official to run for cover. Now, in that town, I should say, that city did not run for cover at all. Quite the opposite. They were more than happy to litigate that if the so-called complainant wanted to. But it was, we were able to resolve that, without going to court, and that memorial is going to stand. So yeah, a lot of times that squeaky wheel getting the grease syndrome kicks in. But that's where we come in, typically, and inform, the person in government that actually, no, that's not the case. Just because this person, claims that this is somehow a violation of the First Amendment, that doesn't make it so. Here's what the law actually is, and in a lot of cases, that's all it takes. They just had a misunderstanding of what the law required of them. Yeah. And once we can, educate them, bring them up to speed on what the law is, they make the right decision. Now, sometimes they've got an agenda and they're trying to drive it, and if that's the case, we have to go to court. Well, so be it. We'll go to court and we'll win. And you want to appeal it and go up to an appellate court, we'll win there too, and we'll set a precedent that protects people on a broader scale.
Let's take a break. When we come back, though, I want to point out that when you stand for religious liberty, it isn't just for Christians. We'll talk about a synagogue case, and you're the one that brought up, and we did mention it the other day, that now they're talking about a permanent mask mandate in one of these states, and you just can't believe these kinds of things. So we're going to get into some of those, and they'll get into some other topics as well. Let me just mention that if you go to the website right now, you're going to see that we have a banner there. It says Hope for America, and if nothing else, trying to give you some hope and recognize that if nothing else, even though sometimes the woke mob is loud, there are more of you than there are of them, and we certainly have very good reasons to be hopeful. We've already talked about one case which comes out of Delaware. We'll talk about another case coming out of Houston. We'll talk about what's going on in Oregon and a couple of others that are going on, and they are winning those cases right and left, and you would not know it if you didn't listen to Point of View. So once again, recognize that a majority of Americans identify as people just like you that are listening to Point of View, and so there's a lot of us out there, and there's reason to be hopeful if we can get the information out. And so one of the ways in which you can guarantee that we continue broadcasting is to click on that banner, and if you want to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate that. You will find some information that we've sent to you by mail, and even some email campaign is taking place. We just want you to recognize there's hope for America, and we'll continue talking about that right after these important messages.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for the final hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We have in studio with us still Lathan watching. Of course, go to firstliberty.org. But let's talk about a different website for just a minute before we get back to some of your cases, and that is supremecurrent.org. supremecoup.com. Now, coup is spelled C-O-U-P, but supremecoup.com, and this is, the footnote says, exposing the lie of court reform and the radical plan to destroy America's judicial system. And so there was an attempt to even talk about trying to pack the court. And isn't it interesting that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, nevertheless said, well, it's a nice piece of legislation, but we're not going to bring it to the floor.
Right. You know, we couldn't have planned this really any better the day we launched supremecoup.com. The Dems in the House held a press conference and actually introduced their bill to pack the court. So
Yes.
we want to thank them for that.
Created a lot of it. Yeah, because there was supposed to be a commission. Then there was supposed to be the bills, and I think they just got antsy or whatever. I don't know.
Whatever. Yeah, we'll take it. Thank you, because they drove a lot of traffic to our website.
Yeah, I guess.
But later that day, Speaker Pelosi, in her usual press conference, was asked about it, and she said, I'm not bringing the bill. I have no intent to bring this bill to the floor.
Talk about controversial.
Right. And, you know, if there's one thing that you can always trust when it comes to politicians, and that is they will do what's in their own self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
And the number one priority for Speaker Pelosi is to remain Speaker Pelosi. And she knows she's only got about an 8-seat majority. And if she brought that bill to the floor and held a vote, it might pass. It's going nowhere in the Senate, so it's not going to accomplish what you want. And you're going to put a bunch of your Democrat congressmen who may be in moderate to swing districts on the record. And the R's don't have to flip many of those seats for her to lose that speaker's chair. And I think that's probably the primary reason why she decided maybe we won't take a vote on this.
And I just might mention, we'll get to this in just a minute because you've worked on political campaigns, want to get your thoughts, but since World War II, the president's party loses an average of 26 House seats and 4 Senate seats in the midterm elections. And we've seen that whether it was Bill Clinton, certainly we saw that with Barack Obama. Back in 2010, Republicans swept the congressional map and gained 63 House seats. So if you only have an 8-seat majority, you can understand that it's probably not going to look good for Democrats a year from now, or a year and a half from now, but nevertheless, that is the case. And just an illustration again of how controversial court packing is, even in the Democratic Party. And we do have that link if you'd like to follow it at pointofview.net. Of course, you can go to First Liberty and find the link to supremecoup.com, as well as, of course, firstlibertylive.com. You got all sorts of extra websites people have to keep track of.
We're really, really busy.
Yes, you certainly are. Okay, let's get to this. We talked about a number of cases. This one out of Houston has to do with a synagogue, but let's, if you can, give us some back history, because you had to fight a very contentious battle here in Dallas, and that took, I think, years. This one in Houston only took couple of weeks, didn't it? So in some respects, it shows the value of precedence, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it shows that we're making progress.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. We had a very, very similar issue here in the Dallas area with a small Orthodox Jewish community who were initially sort of opposed by the homeowners association, because what's going on is you have a Orthodox Jewish community, and you'll have a rabbi who will typically host those people in his home for worship. And in the case in Dallas, the homeowners association initially opposed them, and then they got the city involved, and the city was throwing up a lot of roadblocks, and we ended up having to go to litigation, and I believe that took a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And just to demonstrate the all-knowing, all-wise government, the last sticking point for the city of Dallas was whether or not the rabbi was providing enough parking in front of his house. Now, keep in mind, these are Orthodox Jews who are prohibited from driving on the Sabbath. They walk there. That's why they live in the neighborhood. So Dallas was really worried that there were just not enough parking for people who don't drive. Now, take that, and that took a couple of years. Now we have almost the same issue in Houston. Well, it's a little bit different in that Houston doesn't really have zoning. And so there is a homeowners association in this neighborhood, but the homeowners association was fine with it. They didn't really have an issue. The city of Houston decided they were going to enforce restrictive covenants against this small Orthodox Jewish community who had purchased a home in this neighborhood to use as a gathering space. And, presumably because someone complained to the city. I think was what the city said. And my first thought is, in a city the size of Houston, how many complaints get called in on a daily basis to the city of Houston? And if you've ever driven in the city of Houston, this is what the city is going to spend their time and your tax dollars on. This small little group of people who want to meet in this home to worship. And so, we represented them, let the city know that we were, filing and initially did file a federal lawsuit. But the city quickly backtracked, and we won this one in a couple of weeks. So we went from 2 years to win down to a couple of weeks. So I think, whether or not they knew about the case in Dallas or not, we're making progress on this. And that's a win. Yes, it's a small Orthodox Jewish community, and it's a small home that they're meeting in, but that's a house of worship for them.
Right.
And this is why we represent people of all faiths, because when we protect that small Orthodox Jewish community and the little home that they want to worship in, when we win, it's a win for you and your house of worship as well, because that establishing that principle, whether or not it's actually resolved in court or not, protects everybody, and that's why we do what we do. The First Amendment, requires it. It's the right thing to do. If we want freedom for ourselves, we have to be willing to protect freedom for others.
Well, and again, some people might say, well, I'm not Jewish, so what's the value? Well, have you ever had a Bible study in your home? Because our listeners out in California are well aware that there have been numerous cases, or our listeners in New York, as they have. In a couple of cases, we've seen situations where they simply said a home Bible study is not allowed. And you just look around going, seriously? Given the fact that down the street somebody might have this wild, raucous party, Bible studies usually aren't very raucous, and they have no problem with that, and yet they don't want to have a Bible study because all it takes is one kind of anti-religious person to complain, and pretty soon they have to call up First Liberty to get some kind of relief.
That's exactly right, and the government is required to be neutral towards religion. That's really been the sort of the impetus of most of our work in the last year during the pandemic. If you're going to allow people, not that they need the government's permission to get together and have a poker night in their home with 20 people, if that's what they want to do. If you're going to allow that, you can't tell the people next door they can't have 20 people there to study the Bible or to host a worship service of whatever religion, that they're worshiping. So, the government's required to be neutral towards religion, to treat it no different than it treats, a similarly situated secular organization. There's a tongue twister for you, by the way. Also, try saying that 3 times fast. But that's what the Constitution requires, and that's where our work comes in.
I might just mention, since we're coming to a break, one of the things I might mention is First Liberty is going to probably have to get real busy real soon because we're coming to graduations, and you know as well as I do that all it takes is for one student to say, "God, Jesus Christ," give his or her testimony, and all of a sudden we're back in that issue. And when you were talking about that, I thought it was a good illustration because we have what's called the Equal Access Act that says, look, if you're going to have a debate club or a chess club or a ski club, then you can't say you can't have a Bible club. And the same thing, if you got a graduation, they may want you, if you're the valedictorian, the salutatorian, to actually give a list of the things you're going to talk about, or maybe even a script. And that's fine because that makes sense. It will make sure you're not going to say something that's going to get them in trouble. But just because you mention your faith, and again, if some Indian background student, some whose parents came from India, talks about Hinduism, they would probably look at that and go, "It's fine." A Muslim student talks about that, but it's always when all of a sudden somebody mentions God or Jesus Christ, boom, and they have to oftentimes contact you, and you've had kind of a cottage industry in that regard.
Yeah, we're typically pretty busy around graduation season, and again, sometimes, and I think a lot of times, it's just a misunderstanding sometimes by the superintendent or the school board as to what the law requires, and they think that by telling that student you can't mention your faith in your speech, that they're somehow upholding the Establishment Clause because this is a public school and we can't have religion in a public school. But what they're actually doing is infringing upon the Free Exercise Clause, the very next phrase in the First Amendment. And they just need to understand that that speech is not the school district's. It's not the school district speaking. It's the student speaking. And if you're And again, sometimes it is somebody just using that as an excuse because they have an agenda. Well, if you're really concerned about somebody thinking that you're violating the Establishment Clause, it's a very simple fix. Just slap a disclaimer on the graduation program that says, just like you hear on here, these remarks do not reflect the opinion of the school district. They are the speakers and the speakers alone.
You don't leave your rights at the schoolhouse gate, if I remember a Supreme Court precedent. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Lathan Watt's with us for a few more minutes, Director of Public Affairs for First Liberty. One of the things I love about Lathan, not only does he have a legal degree, but he also has a history degree. And number three, so you are, certainly good. You have been involved in a lot of political campaigns, and that is sort of helpful because for just a minute, I thought we might just get a sense, as we were alluding to, of what the future might hold. And there's this very good piece that Ken Spain put out. He's one of the communications directors with the National Republican Congressional Committee and all of that. But he points out that in the spring of 2009, the cover of Time magazine declared Republicans as an endangered species. Now, as soon as it shows up on Time magazine, you know it'll be false. I remember when Time magazine said, the housing market ready to explode. No, it collapsed within 6 months after that cover. So it is almost like we've said, the jinx that shows shows up in Sports Illustrated.
Right.
You don't want to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And I'm waiting for somebody now to declare Republicans an endangered species, because we do know what is coming. Let me remind you once again that since World War II, the president's party, on average, loses 26 House seats and 4 Senate seats. Well, if that happens, all of a sudden Joe Biden's going to say, where did all the Democrats go? And in 2010, this was just right after this declaration by Time magazine, Republicans actually gained 63 House seats. Now, that may not necessarily happen, but you have something else, and I'd love to get your thoughts. If you're running a campaign as a Democrat right now, and you have to recognize that 80% of Americans think that Washington should focus on strengthening the economy, and so far you've passed a $1.9 trillion bill supposedly rescuing the economy. Now you want to spend another $2.3 trillion on infrastructure. You focused on everything from critical race theory to trying to expand the Supreme Court, to trying to get the District of Columbia as a state. Then you have teachers' unions not letting students back in the classroom, and you're supporting that, and you've got a crisis at the border. Is that a good way to run a 2022 campaign?
No. No, it's not.
And that is exactly what's unfolding right before everybody's eyes right now. And you just pointed out a minute ago that Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, I'm not even going to bring to the floor a vote on whether or not to pack the Supreme Court, because I know what's going to happen after that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she knows how thin her majority is, and she clearly knows that the general trend throughout history is, the midterm following a general election, the party out of power typically picks up seats, and the R's don't have too many seats to pick up, to make her no longer the speaker. And so in some ways, it's surprising to me that they have taken action on so many pretty hard left priorities.
Right.
Now, in some ways, you're doing that to appease your base because you want to fire them up and make sure they show up for the midterms. But when you do that, the opposite is also true. You're firing up the other guy's base to come out and vote against this sort of thing, and they don't really have a whole lot to campaign on as far as achievements or accomplishments, especially considering you control both houses of the legislature and the White House. Now, yes, it's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, and so you can talk about gridlock if you want to, but that's
They only go so far with radicals these days.
Yeah. Exactly. And
I pointed out this last hour that they dumped BS, as they call it, or manure in front of the White House as a Earth Day activist. I mean, these are the people that are saying that even what you're doing, President Biden, calling for a cut in the CO2 emissions from this country by 50% by the rest of this decade is not enough. So these are people wanting all sorts of things that haven't even been proposed yet, right?
Right, and for the moderate to independent voter that a lot of times in many districts can make the difference, in who wins. I mean, these things strike me as completely out of touch with that person. That maybe they're not a political nerd like me, that they're following all of this very closely, but it is sort of dominating the news cycle, and they see this and that none of this makes sense to me. I mean, if that's really what we're going to get by giving your party control of the House and at least a 50-50 split in the Senate and the White House, and this is what we get for it, then maybe I should give the other guy a look. And just as you pointed out, and that memo points out, that is the historical trend. There are a couple of exceptions here and there. I think George W. Bush in the midterm after 9/11 actually picked up seats for his
one
party.
of the few exceptions.
But that's the exception that proves the rule. In general, the other party picks up some seats. So there's, like you said, there's about a year and a half between now and then, and that is a lifetime in politics, especially in the 24-hour news cycle. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the next year and a half that could shape the way the turnout in the midterms happens. But typically, the party out of power does pick up some seats, and the margins are so thin. The R's don't have a lot of ground to make up to end up back in control of the House and possibly in control of the Senate. And when you've got divided government like that, it's very difficult to govern with one of the three branches of government. And look, divided government some people get frustrated with, oh, well, nothing's getting done. I personally never sleep better than when the federal government is getting nothing done.
And your rights are secure.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think the founders knew that.
Yeah.
It's sort of there are lots of challenges, problems you could bring up with the two-party system, right? But along the political spectrum of ideas, there's really only two directions you can pull. You can pull to the right or you can pull to the left. And this two-party system has, up until maybe, the last 10, 20 years, has kept America from making huge swings in policy direction one way or the other, with, a few exceptions that sort of prove the rule. And so that if you've got, both parties pulling in opposite directions, think of it like the rope in a tug of war. The middle, which is the line where policy moves, actually doesn't move too far to one direction or the other. And that's actually a good thing.
And again, you've seen such a swing with the Biden-Harris, or some people call it now the Harris-Biden administration, and that is certainly going to turn off a lot of voters, although it will energize others. And I'll just add one other thing, since we don't have time to talk about it. We are going to redraw all these congressional districts. Most of those are being drawn by Republican legislatures, and as a result, who knows what could happen a year and a half from now. So just wanted to give some of our listeners some hope. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we talk for Hope for America. But we've said, I am hopeful if we can get the right information out. We know the truth. We want to present that truth. And we recognize we're not being well served by the media. I'm going to have Kelly share a statistic that he ran across the other day. This is a polling that was done in which, and I'm pretty sure I'm accurately reporting this, only 8% of Americans trust the media. I want to know who the 8%. No, I'm sure you can't get 100% to agree the sky is blue. Right. So this is basically saying almost all of America. I mean, this is now less than double digits. Don't trust the media, the mainstream media. And so I'm hoping that's why you're coming to us, because we want to tell you the truth. We encourage you to join the Truth Team. And most importantly, we encourage you to go to that website, Hope for America. And it's at our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll find out more about First Liberty and supremecoup.com. And then I guess today you might even be doing a First Liberty.
First Liberty Live. Yeah, that's exactly right. With Shannon Bream.
That's right. That's right. Shannon Bream, who's on the show with us the other day. So you can find all of that on the website. Just follow all the links. And if you got any questions, of course, you can give us a call off air, 800-347-5151, which is the line that you can call for customer service. But if nothing else, Lathan, it's always great to have you in studio.
Thanks for having me back.
And again, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. As you might imagine, we have Kelly Shackelford Penedexter tomorrow. It's going to be a really great weekend edition, and we hope to see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you